My name is Margaret, and some days memory does not arrive gently. It does not knock politely or wait for permission. Some days, memory simply opens a door inside you, and suddenly you are not the age your body says you are. Suddenly, you are small again. That is what happened the morning I found my mother's recipe book. It was an ordinary morning, quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to houses where no one is rushing anymore. I was standing in my kitchen, the sunlight falling softly across the table, warming the worn wood the way it had done for decades. I wasn't looking for anything special. I was just cleaning, slowly, one drawer at a time, the way elderly hands prefer to move, careful, patient, unhurried. I opened the lower drawer I rarely touch. Inside were old things, a folded cloth, a broken handle, a few utensils I never use but never throw away. And beneath them, pressed flat against the wood, was a thin notebook. At first, I didn't recognize it. The cover was faded, the edges soft from years of being opened and closed. It looked tired, like it had lived a long life quietly. I lifted it gently, my fingers already slowing, as if my body knew before my mind did. And then I saw the writing. My breath caught in my chest. I knew that handwriting. I hadn't seen it in years, but I knew it instantly. The uneven letters, the slight slant, the way certain words leaned closer together like they were whispering secrets. My mother's handwriting. I sat down at the kitchen table without even realizing I was moving. The chair scraped softly against the floor. My hands trembled as I opened the notebook. Recipes, page after page of recipes, written by her. Apple cake, Sunday soup, for Margaret, don't forget the salt. I stared at those words and suddenly my kitchen felt smaller, or maybe I felt smaller inside it. My chest tightened, and I felt something rise from deep inside me, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt like a child, not in a foolish way, in a vulnerable way, in the way you feel when you suddenly remember who once took care of you before you knew how to take care of yourself. My mother died many years ago, long enough that most people assume the pain has softened completely, and in many ways it has. I don't wake up crying for her. I don't ache the way I did in the beginning. But grief doesn't disappear. It changes shape. Sometimes it waits quietly inside ordinary objects. I ran my fingers across the ink on the page. The letters were slightly smudged in places where her hand must have brushed against wet ink or where time had blurred the lines. I imagined her standing in this same kitchen, pen in hand, writing while something simmered on the stove. I could almost hear the sounds, the pot bubbling, the spoon tapping against the edge, her voice calling my name. "Margaret, come taste this." My throat tightened and my eyes filled with tears before I could stop them. I whispered softly, "Mama." I hadn't said that word in years. Mama. It came out small and broken, like it belonged to someone much younger than the woman sitting at the table now. And for a moment, I didn't fight it. I let myself be small. Because in that moment, I didn't want to be 72. I wanted to be the girl who stood on a chair to reach the counter, the girl who licked batter from the spoon when she thought no one was watching, the girl who believed her mother knew how to fix everything. I turned the page slowly. There were notes in the margins, little reminders written just for herself. Too much heat ruins it. Let it rest. Be patient. I smiled through tears. She wrote recipes the way she lived, with patience, with care, with love hidden in small details. I pressed the book gently against my chest, holding it the way you hold something precious and fragile. My arms wrapped around it instinctively, as if the notebook could feel it. And in that moment, something painful became clear. I didn't just miss my mother, I missed being someone's child. When you grow old, people forget you were ever small. They see your age and assume you have outgrown longing. But the truth is, the need to be held never truly leaves. It just becomes quieter. I sat there at the table, the sunlight warming my hands, tears slipping down my cheeks silently. I wasn't sobbing, I wasn't dramatic. I was simply letting memory move through me the way it needed to. I opened the book again and saw a page with a small stain, a splash of oil or sauce long dried, and suddenly I laughed softly, a broken little laugh. "You were messy," I whispered, smiling. I could see her now, wiping her hands on her apron, shaking her head, telling me not to worry about perfection. She used to say, "As long as it tastes good." I thought about how many times I had cooked these recipes without realizing where they came from, how many times I had repeated her motions without remembering her hands taught me first. I thought about how much of her lived inside me, not just in my face, but in my habits, my patience, my quiet strength. The recipe book rested open on the table, her handwriting catching the light, and for the first time in many years, I didn't feel like an old woman remembering the past. I felt like a daughter remembering her mother. And that feeling hurt, but it also felt like love. And I stayed seated at the table longer than I meant to, my hands resting on the open pages, my eyes tracing each line as if I were learning to read all over again. Her handwriting felt alive beneath my fingertips, as if warmth still lingered in the ink. I turned another page and smiled softly when I saw how she underlined certain words. Slowly, she had written next to one step. I could almost hear her voice saying it, calm but firm, reminding me not to rush. My mother never liked rushing. She believed good things needed time, whether it was soup or people. The kitchen around me felt different now. The same walls, the same table, the same quiet, but memory had filled the space. I could almost hear the clink of dishes, the hum of the stove, the sound of her footsteps moving back and forth. The present and the past were standing side by side, not fighting, just existing together. I closed my eyes and let myself remember. I remembered standing beside her as a child, my chin barely reaching the counter. I remembered how she would let me stir even when I made a mess. I remembered how she would laugh instead of scolding me, wiping the counter with a cloth and saying, "We'll clean later." In her kitchen, mistakes were never disasters. They were part of learning. That memory made my chest ache because life didn't always treat mistakes so kindly. Somewhere along the way, I learned to be harder on myself. I learned to expect perfection. I learned to apologize for taking up space. But my mother never asked me to be perfect. She asked me to be patient. I opened my eyes and turned to a page with a recipe I recognized immediately. It was the soup she made when someone was sick, the soup that seemed to cure everything, not because of its ingredients, but because of how she served it. Always hot, always with bread, always with a quiet hand on your forehead. I whispered, "You always knew what to do." My voice sounded small again, and I didn't stop it. I let it be small. I thought about the day she taught me this recipe. I must have been no more than 10. She stood beside me, guiding my hands, correcting me gently. When I made a mistake, she didn't sigh. She didn't show disappointment. She simply said, "Try again." Try again. How many times had I needed to hear that as an adult? I realized then that this recipe book was not just a collection of meals. It was a record of how she loved. Each note in the margin was a reminder. Each stain was proof of life lived fully, imperfectly. I turned another page and found something unexpected. A note, written in a different tone, softer, almost personal. From Margaret, when you feel alone. My breath stopped. I stared at those words until they blurred. My mother had written my name, not as a heading, not as a label, but as a message. I pressed my mouth to my hand, tears spilling freely now. I didn't try to wipe them away. They dropped onto the page, leaving small dark marks. For a moment I felt guilty for crying on her book, but then I smiled through my tears. She wouldn't mind. She would understand. I leaned forward, resting my forehead lightly against the open notebook, and whispered, "I am alone sometimes." The truth felt heavy and honest in the quiet kitchen. Being old doesn't mean loneliness disappears. In some ways it grows quieter but deeper, like a well. You learn to live with it, but moments like this make it rise to the surface. I lifted my head and continued reading the note she had written years ago. The words were simple. Eat something warm, sit down, breathe. You'll be all right. I laughed softly, a sound mixed with tears. "You were always right," I said. And suddenly the ache inside me shifted. It didn't disappear, but it softened. Because even though she was gone, her voice was still here, not in sound, but in guidance, in memory, in ink. I closed the book gently and held it in my lap, rocking slightly without realizing it, the way you rock a child, or the way you rock yourself when comfort is needed. I realized something then, something that felt both sad and comforting. When I lost my mother, I didn't just lose a person. I lost the place where my worries went. I lost the person who would listen without fixing, the person who would say, "Come sit," instead of, "You should have known better." And yet, here she was, not alive, not present in the way I wished, but present enough to remind me how to treat myself, with patience, with warmth, with forgiveness. I stood slowly and placed the recipe book on the counter, opening it to the soup recipe. My hands moved almost on their own, reaching for a pot, setting it on the stove. I wasn't hungry, but hunger wasn't the point. Memory was. I chopped vegetables the way she taught me, slowly, carefully. I added salt the way she reminded herself to. I stirred and waited, letting the steam rise and fill the kitchen with a familiar smell. And as I cooked, I felt something unexpected. Joy. Not loud joy, not excitement, but a quiet, gentle joy. The kind that comes when something broken inside you finds its shape again. I imagined her standing beside me, watching without interfering, smiling softly. I imagined her nodding approval, not because I did it perfectly, but because I tried. When the soup was ready, I sat down at the table again, a small bowl in front of me, the recipe book open beside it. I took one spoon and closed my eyes. It tasted like home. It tasted like safety. It tasted like childhood. Tears slid down my cheeks again, but I didn't mind. They felt different now. They felt full. I whispered,
thank you, not just for the recipe, but for the love, for the patience, for the reminder that even at 72, I am still someone's child. And that realization stayed with me as I sat there quietly, spoon in hand, heart full, remembering who I was and who I still am.
And the kitchen felt warmer than before, not because the stove was on, but because memory had filled the air with something alive. I finished the soup slowly, the way my mother always did. She never rushed meals. She believed eating was a moment to rest, not just a task. I found myself placing the spoon down between bites, breathing, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The walls didn't speak, but they remembered. After I washed the bowl, I dried my hands carefully and returned to the table. The recipe book still lay open, its pages gently curved from years of use. I traced the edge of the paper once more, then closed it slowly, as if saying good night. I carried the book into the living room and sat in my chair by the window. The afternoon light had softened, turning golden. Dust floated lazily in the air. Outside, life moved on. Cars passed, a child laughed somewhere, a bird landed briefly on the fence and flew away again. Time didn't stop for my memories, and that was all right. I placed the recipe book on my lap and rested my hands on top of it. For a moment, I imagined my mother sitting across from me, her hands folded the way she used to when she watched me quietly. She never stared, she observed gently, with love that didn't demand attention. "I wish you could see me now," I whispered, not because I needed her approval, but because I wanted her presence. Then softly another thought arrived, one that surprised me with its calm. Maybe she already does. Maybe the parts of her that mattered most never truly left. They simply settled into me, into the way I cook, the way I wait, the way I speak to myself when no one else is listening. I thought about how many years I had lived without her physical presence, how many moments I had survived without being able to call her, how many decisions I made without her advice. And yet, somehow, I was still here, still breathing, still remembering, still loving. That, I realized, was not weakness. That was inheritance. I leaned my head back against the chair and closed my eyes. I didn't try to stop the tears that came then. They were gentle tears, grateful tears, the kind that don't ask to be fixed. I remembered the last time I saw my mother clearly. She looked tired but peaceful. She held my hand and said, "You'll be all right." I didn't believe her then. I do now, because even on days when loneliness creeps in, even on days when my house feels too quiet, I have learned something important. I carry her with me in ways that matter, in the way I choose kindness over hardness, in the way I forgive myself when I make mistakes, in the way I let myself rest. The recipe book is now on a shelf in my living room, not hidden away. I don't open it every day. I don't need to. Just knowing it is there is enough. It reminds me that love leaves traces. It reminds me that care can be written down. It reminds me that memory can live in ink and still feel warm. Sometimes when the evening comes and the house grows quiet again, I make one of her recipes, not because I'm hungry, but because I want to feel close, because stirring a pot feels like conversation, because tasting something familiar feels like being understood. And every time, without fail, I feel smaller for a moment, not helpless, held. If you are listening to my story right now, I want to tell you this gently. No matter how old you are, there are parts of you that will always belong to the people who loved you first. You don't grow out of being someone's child. You don't outgrow the need to feel remembered. And when memory comes, in handwriting, in scent, in taste, let it. Let yourself feel small again for a moment. Let yourself miss. Let yourself cry. It doesn't mean you are weak. It means you loved deeply. That evening, as the light faded and the room grew dim, I stood and carried the recipe book back to the kitchen. I placed it in the drawer again, but this time gently, intentionally, not hidden, just resting. Before closing the drawer, I whispered softly, "Good night, Mama." Then I closed it. I returned to my chair by the window, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and watched the world outside settle into night. My body felt tired, but my heart felt strangely full. Because that day, I didn't just find a recipe book. I found my mother. And for a little while, I was a child again.